Howdy Doomtown fans, Willingdon here. I'm back to review No Turning Back. This is the 5th saddlebag expansion for Doomtown Reloaded. As is the custom, we're going to be looking at the dudes in this first part of the video. We'll be looking at all the rest of the cards in the second part of the video. First up, we have a familiar face. This is Klein. She's a 4th ring dude, a 9 of spades. She's 6 to play, and she's 2 upkeep. She's 1 draw and 3 influence. This is Experience 1 version of her. She's Huckster 1, and she's also Harrowed. She has an ability, Noon Boot. If Abby is at a deed in town, choose an opposing dude with lower influence in town. Move them to Abby's location. I've been a pretty big fan of the original Klein. She's always made the cut in a lot of my 4th ring decks as just a cheap way to get 2 influence. And the Harrowed is kind of nice, and having a backup Huckster is pretty nice as well. But that 2 upkeep has always hurt the original version of Abby. Her Experience version, we're getting another influence. We're getting another Huckster point. We're still only paying the 2 upkeep. That's a big deal in my opinion. The Noon Boot ability is pretty awesome. Being able to move your somebody's dude around to her location, you're going to be able to maybe dogpile on the guy. You could have your main Huckster there, or you could just equip her with some sort of nasty spell that you're aiming to do on the guy later. I think this is a pretty sweet ability, and I think it's one that's going to be worth including her in your deck. This is especially sweet for spells like Puppet or Phantasm, where you're using some sort of noon spell and you're primarily doing it against a dude at the location. Especially Puppet, I found that spell extraordinarily difficult to actually use just because it's a noon ability and you're just going to walk up to the dude's location and it's very obvious what you're trying to do with it. You usually don't have a lot of surprises. If Abby's equipped with this, I think it's suddenly a lot scarier because there's not really a whole lot they can do about Abby's ability. And she has this 3 influence, so her ability is going to hit quite a few dudes. It's definitely going to be a liability to boot down your lower influence dudes if she's sitting in a deed in town and has a spell of some sort, especially something like Puppet. It also seems like it's going to work pretty well to use her ability with dudes that you've booted with things like Paralysis Mark. It seems to me like it's going to be pretty easy to use her ability to move their guys around and really mess up what they're trying to do. Seems like a frustrating ability to try to play against. I'm really liking this stuff like Avi and Phantasm, these 4th ring things that allow us to move around our opponent's dudes. I think it makes for a lot of really interesting interactions, and it seems like a uniquely sort of magical effect. The big weakness of Avi is just this 6 cost and 2 upkeep. You are getting 3 influence for that, which is pretty nice. It's especially in 4th ring, you're not exactly incredible at influence. You could kind of use some big dude that's worth a bunch of influence. But man, 6 cost, 2 upkeep, that's going to be really expensive for a lot of decks. I don't think 4th ring's got the most robust economy in the game. I think you're probably going to exclude her from a lot of decks just on that basis. Next up, we have another familiar face. This is Judge Harry Somerset. He's an 8 of spades, 7 to play, 2 upkeep. He's 1 draw, 3 influence. He's a deputy, Experience 1. He has Noon Job Boot. Mark a wanted dude. A 2-stud gunslinger token enters play booted and joins your posse. If successful, discard the mark. Remove the gunslinger from the game after the job. This guy is just so much better than his Experience level 0 version. I'm pretty impressed with this. I've always kind of felt like original Judge Harry Somerset was kind of on the cusp of playability. He was really good against some of the more passive decks, but I didn't really like to play him. He has that low value. He's still expensive and things like that. This is just way better. I've talked before how I'm a big fan of Dead Man's Law Dog, and this is undeniably going straight in that deck. This 8 is just going to perfectly fit the draw value. I think there's plenty of Law Dogs decks where 8 is going to fit the draw value. I talked about before, 8 is just overall the best number for a draw value. So unless you're maxed out on 8s, which I've only ever done by pumping my deck full of Stephen Wiles, I think you're just automatically going to play this guy instead of the original Harry. You're only paying one more. The job ability is better, and he's got a way better value. He's still got the same stats. This just seems like a drastic improvement to me over the original Judge Harry Somerset. Really, the only disadvantage is the fact that when you succeed on the job, you just discard the guy instead of acing the guy. But I don't know, that feels pretty marginal to me. It seems like getting the Gunslinger is going to be better than being able to just ace the guy versus discard. All around, I see this as being a big improvement over the original Judge Harry Somerset, and I don't really see you playing the original version unless, like I said, you're maxed out on 8s. Next up, we have another Law Dog dude. This is Ebenezer Springfield. He's a Queen of Spades, 4 to play, no upkeep. He's 1 draw, 0 influence. Blessed 0, and he has React. After another player's ability affects your dude at this or an adjacent location, add 1 bounty to one of that player's dudes who is not wanted. In a vacuum, this guy seems pretty good. Just the fact that he's Blessed 0 with no upkeep, that alone would make him playable in a lot of miracle-oriented decks. But if you look at the context of the card pool, that space is a little crowded. We have both Perry Inbody and Andrew Burton, both of which are blessed with no upkeep. So if you're not looking to start multiple blessed dudes, I think you're going to have to cut some, and you're going to have to pull back on one or the other. Seems to me like Inbody has just objectively the strongest ability, especially if you can routinely make that skill check. The thing that Burton has going for him is the ability to add the bounty, which is also something that this Ebenezer guy can do, but Burton can do it way easier. You just choose a guy and they get a bounty. I mean, granted, you get to do it only at the beginning of the game, but it's way more straightforward. It's way easier to do the bounty thing. I could see the merits of playing Ebenezer over Andrew if there was a different grifter that you wanted to start, but I think for now, Burton is quite a bit better than somebody like Travis. So unless there's another grifter that gets printed that's just incredible for Law Dogs, I think you're probably going to pick Andrew over Ebenezer. And I think if you want to start 2 blessed guys because you're playing a ton of miracle stuff, you would probably rather have Reverend Perry Inbody over Ebenezer. One thing I could see is that if you're playing Ebenezer and Andrew, it might help a deck that uses the arsenal to actually get dudes wanted. That's definitely a challenge for that deck versus the original Law Dogs outfit. So I could see having these additional wanted abilities, the ability to give dudes bounties, being worth it over the additional abilities that Perry brings to the table. It's worth pointing out that Ebenezer has a much better value than either of those 2 guys at Queen. I could maybe see that being good if you played him in your deck rather than in your starting posse. Like if you want to pull him on values, that could be nice. It also makes him better against like shotgun and stuff like that. But the problem with that is that you usually are worried about your guys getting shotgun that are worth influence, because, you know, influence is how you don't lose the game. So it usually matters a lot more when they shotgun an influence dude, and none of the dudes we're talking about here have any influence. If you're putting a bunch of miracles on him, though, that could matter. You know, you don't want to necessarily lose all of these miracles that you've committed to a dude to something stupid like shotgun. I don't know, this guy's an interesting option. I think that it's nice to have some more blessed dude options, especially at no upkeep. I don't know if this guy's immediately going to see a lot of play, but I think that he fits into, especially the Arsenal deck, the blessed Arsenal deck, pretty well. and I could see this guy seeing a little bit of play there. Next up, we have another familiar face. This is Ebenezer Boldmann. He's a 9 of spades, 6 to play with 1 upkeep. He's a Morgan Cattle Company dude. He's 0 draw, 2 influence, experienced 1, and he's Mad Scientist 3. He has Shootout Boot, Unboot a Gadget. You can use its abilities another time. If it's experimental, unboot a lander. If it's a weapon, it provides an extra +1 bullets and its dude becomes a stud. Well, the core problem with the original Ebenezer Boldmann is this: if you pull a club, discard the dude. That definitely makes him pretty limitedly playable. Obviously, clubs tend to be pretty good effects, and if you want to have a good draw structure, you're probably going to have to include some clubs. So this not having the club restriction alone seems pretty decent to me. That said, the whole Kyle Wagner R&D Ranch thing is pretty awesome. So I think there's already some incentives to not play clubs or only play a very limited number of them. This guy's pretty okay. I like him maybe a little bit better than the original Lander, although I feel like he's less of a good starting dude. I think that the unbooting the gadget, that's going to matter a lot more as we get more gadgets, especially experimental weapon gadgets, since you'd be able to trigger both of these abilities here. Unbooting a lander doesn't seem that great to me. I don't think he's really going to be able to do that much. But the weapon thing, that seems pretty good. So this guy's an improvement for sure. I just don't know if you're going to want to play him that much over the original one. I could see maybe starting the original one and then playing this guy in your deck, especially since 9s seem like a pretty good draw value. Like, you've got the mechanical horse for your gadget, and you've also got a bunch of other high-quality cards and deeds at 9. So I think in general, your 9s were already something you were considering for a draw value. This guy could fit into that pretty well. He's got some useful abilities. Mad Scientist 3 is pretty awesome if you're playing a gadget-oriented deck. I could see this guy overall working out. I'm not wildly excited about him, but he does seem okay. Next up, we have a dude for the Sloan Gang. This is Anthea Pan Sophia. She's a 9 of spades, 3 to play, 0 upkeep. She's 0 draw and 1 influence. She's a Huckster 0. If you pull a club while making a Huckster skill test for someone in her posse, add 3 to the skill check. Well, in my last few reviews, I've been talking about how I think Sloan Huckster is slowly becoming a really strong archetype, or at least a playable archetype, and she seems just so good for that type of build. She's a high value, so she's not going to just get chumped by a bunch of spells. She's got no upkeep, so she's not going to cost a lot. And she has an influence at 3 cost. And then you also get this trait that's pretty good overall. Man, this chick seems pretty good for just any type of Sloan deck that's trying to play spells. And it seems to me like it's increasingly the case that you can build a Huckster-based Sloan deck. I'm not exactly sure how to go about that, but she's definitely in my starting posse as I do that. And she's just being a Huckster is kind of just icing on the cake. If she wasn't a Huckster and still had this trait, I'd probably still play her. Man, she's good. This is just a really nice rounding out of that strategy, and I think it's increasingly a realistic option to try to play the Sloan Huckster deck. Next up, we have another dude for the Sloan Gang. This is Harry Highbinder. He is a jack of spades, 4 to play, 2 upkeep. He's 0 draw, 3 influence. Harry cannot attach weapons. While Harry is at the town square, and you have more influence than any other player, you control the town square. Whether or not this guy ends up being good, that trait is pretty cool. Being able to control the town square, I feel like there's a lot of implications of that, and I'm not sure I could really even cover them all. Seems to me like there's a lot of cool things about controlling an area that you can't normally control. Not the least of which is the ability to attach weapons to dudes. Now, unfortunately, you can't attach them to this guy, but being able to equip your other Sloan dudes when they're all in the town square sitting around seems like a worthwhile thing to me. That might be especially nice for the huckster-oriented deck that I was just talking about. Seems to me like being able to put your hexes on your dudes when they're all in the town square, controlling the town square, that's pretty cool to me. Another pretty great thing about this guy is the 3 influence. It's pretty hard to get a lot of influence with most Sloan decks, so just having a dude that has 3 is pretty good, especially when he has a trait that matters and could do something relevant. Now, the no bullets and 2 upkeep, both of those seem like a pretty big problem to me. Sloan usually has a pretty fragile economy, and they usually like to have bullets on their dudes just because they're usually drawing shootout hands. So I don't know, this guy I think has some playability. I think his trait is really cool and interesting, but I'm not exactly sure what to do with it. Now we come to yet another familiar face, but this time he's no longer a Morgan Cattle Company dude. This is Max Bane. He's a 10 of spades, 6 to play, 1 upkeep. He's 1 draw, 2 influence. He's experienced 1. If Max is at the town square or a government deed, ranches provide no control points. Then he has Noon Boot, play a dude with a value 10 or higher at Max's location, reducing their cost by 3 Ghost Rock. This guy is so good, I don't even have a lot to say about it. I mean, this guy's just so obviously awesome. The Noon Boot thing is sweet. That's so good. And I think you could start this guy and just pump your deck full of high-value dudes and just dump them in play and kind of flood dudes. That's pretty sweet. Now, his trait is also really strong. Ranches provide no control points. Hypothetically, that could suck if you played ranches in your deck, but what I'm seeing mainly is that every landslide Morgan Cattle Company control deck plays ranches, and they get, at least 2 or 3 control points from those. And this is just going to prevent that. He's also 2 influence. So, like, if you start him and Jake Smiley, you're going to have 4 influence, and that's only for 8 of your cost. Man, that's awesome. He's also neutral, so you can start him in any deck. This guy is just phenomenal. This is a really, really good design. I really like how the Noon Boot ability encourages you to build your deck around him. And I also really like that he has this trait that kicks Morgan Landslide in the rear. As much as I like to play as Morgan Landslide, it can be kind of frustrating to play against it. And this is just a card that's going to work really well against it, while also having a lot of value and just being worthwhile on his own. Max Bane, this guy rules. I think he's way better than the original version, although it's a very different role than the original version. I would expect to see quite a bit of this guy in the future. Seems like you're just going to build decks around him, or maybe not even build decks around him. Just put him in a deck that already has lots of high-value dudes. There's just a lot of options with this guy. He's pretty straightforwardly good. Next up, we have another neutral dude. This is El Carajo. He is a Jack of Spades, 3 to play with 1 upkeep. He's 1 stud, and he's 0 influence. He has Shootout, boot a melee weapon attached to him to make him a stud and give him +2 bullets to a maximum of 4. Like I said in my La Quema preview, I think that there needs to be more melee weapons in the game for this to really matter a whole lot. But this is a really strong ability, and I think if you're already playing melee weapons in your deck, this could definitely be worth including. It seems like he's going to work pretty well with La Quema, and we'll talk about this guy a little bit more in the next part of the video when we talk fully about La Quema. The last dude in the pack is also neutral. This is Jacqueline Ischium. She is a king of spades, 3 to play, no upkeep. She's 2 draw and 0 influence. She has repeat react. When Jacqueline joins a Mark's posse or a posse opposing a job, she becomes a stud. This chick seems pretty good. The high value, no upkeep, you're not getting any influence, but you are getting those 2 bullets that could potentially become stud. This seems like it's going to be worth that 3 cost. I could see some starting posses wanting to include her. I could see throwing her in there if you want kings on your draw value. It's not exactly a lot of competition at king. Overall, I'm not wildly excited about her, but it seems like it's going to be pretty easy to throw her in decks, especially decks that are weak against shootout-oriented decks that play lots of jobs. It's pretty nice to have a card like this that's neutral. You can start in any deck, you can throw into any deck and not have to pay a whole lot for, and have some sort of cheap defense against the job-oriented, really aggressive draw, shootout-oriented decks. I could see her seeing quite a bit of play. I don't necessarily think the shootout-oriented decks are all that strong, but if they are to become really strong, this is definitely a card you're going to want to remember and play. Well, that's going to do it for part 1 of my No Turning Back review. Be sure to tune in to part 2, where we're going to be looking at all of the non-dudes in the pack. And if you like this video, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.